Hello everybody, I am Mohammad Ali Mokhtari, PhD candidate in Applied Microeconomics from University of Lugano in Switzerland, and today I want to present our joint work with Hamed Quddusi, who is Associated Professor in University of California Polytechnic. This study is about inequality and energy subsidy reform, and we get insight from the largest subsidy reform and cash instead of subsidy reform in developing world. The motivation of this work arises from an interesting video I watched 3 years ago that symbolic dinosaur uh, give an speech in the United Nations and talk to people, say, don't choose extinction. As most of you know, there is huge negative impact of subsidies, energy subsidies on fossil fuels. Despite this negative impact, the reforms remain challenging and there is lack of evidence regarding the short-term and long-term impact of this kind of reforms. One of solutions for this reform proposed by many scientists and studies, uh, they suggest cash transfer instead of these energy subsidies. But their long-term impact, as we said, is not clear. What would happen precisely for inequality and welfare if government start to replace cash instead of energy subsidies? As you know, Iran implemented the three biggest reforms in this context. Among them, the 2010 reform is extremely large. Why? The precise magnitude and dynamics of effect of this reform is not clear in the literature. Summary of these studies: when the government replaced 40 US billion energy subsidy with direct cash transfer, universal cash transfer to whole population, what is the impact of this reform on inequality? This is the key question. What is the summary of finding? We find very progressive effect. We find proper redistribution effect in which the expenditure increased for bottom 70. In other side, expenditure decreased for top 20. And decile 8 is almost reform neutral. We also find Gini index decreased 15% or 6 percentage point 3 years after the reform. And finally, we find cash transfer are the primary source of variation in these inequality measures. Let's start from this intuitive plot. This is Gini coefficient in expenditure in whole country. As you see here, the pretty stable trend in Gini index, very flat and stable with white noise trend, start to decrease slightly and extremely after the proposal of reform and implementation date of reform. We claim that all this drop in Gini index arises from this energy subsidy reform. Why it tends to return to previous uh, quantity slowly? We show this decrease arises from the reform and the increase arises from the decrease in real value of cash transfer that government transferred to household after the reform. Since the cash transfer stayed flat and fixed, slowly inflation decreased the real amount of cash transfer. This is the whole claim of this study. Let's briefly review the context. As you know, the Iranian government started to implement this reform into December 2010. Before this reform, Iran was one of the least energy efficient country in the world with over than 70 US billion dollar per year, and it was among around 20% of GDP of country. Uh, Government make people to open bank account for each household. Head of household open bank account to receive this cash transfer before the reform. And suddenly in December 2010, government announced new price for energy which increased from baseline level 2 to 9 times, and it was huge increase in price of energy. Instead of this increase in price of energy, government transferred monthly 19 US dollar per person, and it was for whole population, almost whole population in country covered by this cash transfer. What we evaluate and what is our data? We use the data of household expenditure and income survey, which is one of the most traditional survey in Iran, which is very rich and precise. Uh, every year, the Statistical Center of Iran collect data from around 38,000 household, representative household. Our study period is from 1984 to 2019, and our final sample is 36 observation. For each decile year, we have the share of expenditure of that decile in that precise year. Why share of expenditure instead of expenditure? We want to normalize everything uh, from aggregation, cancel out this aggregation and all nominal value. Therefore, the more clear measure is the share of expenditure in each decile to evaluate the impact of reform on inequality. Another part of data arises from cash transfer. As you see here, cash transfer started partially in 2010. This is very small, only one such season in 2010 covered by cash transfer. But from 2019, each individual received 2.18 US dollar per day, which is really large relative to other countries. And slowly, as you see, this real amount of cash transfer tends to decrease. The 2.18 US dollar in the first year after the reform decreased to only 75 cents in 2019. This is the variation of cash transfer we used, and we show that the inequality extremely associated to this real value of cash transfers. In other side, to make a control group, we also use energy consumption data. We return to this later in identification part. How the reform was universal in whole country. How we can make a control group? Unfortunately, there is no actual control group, but we try to make it. How? We look at different expenditure decide and how much energy they consume in absolute value. There should be a reform neutral group when the real amount of cash transfer they receive equals to increase in the price of energy. Therefore, when we look at the precise amount of energy expenditure in each expenditure decile before reform and after price shock, we can evaluate the negative income shock arise from the changing price of energy and put the fixed amount of 19 US dollar per month. If we use this pattern, we can see that this progressivity of reform arises from this pattern. The lower decile, the intuition is this: the lower decile you are, the lower expenditure on energy, the lower amount of expenditure on energy, and the fixed amount of cash transfer generate a positive income shock for this lower decile. In other side, in top of distribution, the higher decile you are, the higher amount of energy expenditure and the cash transfer cannot compensate the uh, amount of energy expenditure. This is the intuition on making this control group. And if we evaluate this positive and negative shock, we can see that for decile 8, we observe almost zero income shock. In fact, decile 8 expand the exactly amount of cash transfer on change in energy expenditure. This is the intuition on making this control group. This is our mathematical model. I don't want to go with this is difference, a standard difference in difference. Of course, decile 8 is control group, and we evaluate the impact of reform. Post-reform time, this is year fixed effect. This is group fixed effect, which is a standard difference in difference. Also to evaluate impact of cash transfer under the assumption that cash transfers are exogenous generated by government and inflation. The variation is exogenous. We can easily regress the inequality measures on cash transfers. About result, here we can see that interaction between being in decile 7 and post increased the share of expenditure. In other side, being in decile 9 times post decreased the share of expenditure. This table established the first finding of this study. The inequality should decrease after the reform. If this decile 7 exposed more, less than decile 9, we can see that their expenditure also follow this pattern. We also need to check the parallel trend. The parallel trend holds here for decile 7 and decile 9, which is two adjacent decile to decile 8. When we establish the inequality decrease, we can then look at the relationship between this inequality and real amount of cash transfer. This green column are the real amount of cash transfer, and you can see that this inequality measures extremely associated to this real amount of cash transfer. This is actual Gini coefficient. This dashed line is predicted by our model, and this is real amount of cash transfer. And you can see large association between these measures of inequality and this real amount of cash transfers. Finally, to strengthen this work, we used microdata as well. Instead of only aggregate data, we used microdata. We removed whole cash transfer from balance sheet of household, and we observed that in absence of cash transfer, you can see that there was no any drop in Gini index. This is actual Gini index, happened immediately after the reform, and this is the counterfactual. In absence of cash transfer, we recalculated Gini index based on quarters to show this is not impact of sanctions. One of debate in this literature arises from the existence of some international and US sanction. And you can see here the impact is observable immediately after the reform. Therefore, it could not be impact of sanction or anything else. Another insight that we get from this reform is if we see large drop in Gini index, we should observe large increase in lower decile. In bottom of distribution, we expect huge positive income shock, and this is observable from this event study plot. This is the logarithm of income for decile 1, and you can see up to 40% increase in income is observable for decile 1. This opened new insight to evaluate the impact of this reform in literature of universal basic income. How poor, lower income individual spend this windfall. Yeah, and this suggests very interesting question would be possible to answer to this natural experiment. Here we look at only decile 1. This is decile logarithm of income in decile 1, as you see here, different years. And relative to decile 8, you can see that the both income and expenditure in decile 1 increased relative to decile 8. We also look at other outcomes like consumption, and the consumption and non-subsidized goods as well. You can see again here we can observe large increase in decile 1 relative to decile 8. To summarize, we look at different inequality measures. We look at monthly and quarterly Gini index, and we exclude cash transfer from household budget to assess the impact of the reform. We find relatively large increase in income, expenditure, consumption, and consumption of non-subsidized goods among lower decile. Therefore, we believe that the Iranian subsidy reform offers significant yet largely unexplored research potential. Thank you very much for your feedbacks. I appreciate any feedbacks regarding to this work. Thank you again from ERF organization and organizer.